Well, this is your Professor Ian. This is a video lecture on mood, tone, and narrative expectation. So let's go through this together. So these are some terms that we're going to be building on mood and tone. So right now we're just going to define these and talk about them and think about how we use our voice as writers to create these things in our stories. So, a couple basic things. Stories are always narrated by a specific voice that shapes our understanding of the text. Sometimes this voice, as we call it, is attributable to a specific narrator, I should say, specific persona, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's like a kind of disembodied third person point of view telling the story. But sometimes it's a very specific embodied persona, if you will, telling the story. Okay, so this is one of the basic choices we make when we're writing, and I'm sure you've all faced this. Should I tell this in the first person? Should I tell it in the third person? Right, this is a fundamental choice, something that you can really alter the feel of your story, right? Because the narrator, right, even if it's an embodied specific persona within your story, or it's this disembodied kind of third person perspective, shapes what we focus on in a story, right? For example, in the story Secret Stream, right, the focus is on Nathan and his experiences in the world. His experiences in the world. We don't get any insights into anybody else in that story. It's all Nathan that we're told about in that story, right? If we compare that to the lack of narrative focus in Lady with a Lamp, where we're just getting this monologue from a character, we don't have a narrator pointing us to notice specific things about the character. It's a very different feel, right? You have to do it requires the reader to do a very different kind of work. In Lady with a Lamp, you need to put together, okay, so they seem like they're friends at first, but then as we learn more about this person by how they speak and how they present themselves and the things they say, we learn that, oh, okay, actually they're more like frenemies, right? This unnamed narrator who does all the speaking doesn't really like Mona, and they have this contentious relationship. Right, we put that together. Whereas in Secret Stream, we're told what we should think about Nathan, sort of, right? Obviously, we're not told you should think this about Nathan, but we're definitely given insights into his thinking, his past, in a much more concrete way than Lady with a Lamp, right? So there's a very different narrative voice going on in those two stories. And the narrative voice and focus help set both the mood for the story, and that's, pardon me. We can define mood as the emotion or feeling that a story conveys, right? And some stories really focus more on mood than on tone and theme, but every story has a kind of mood and a kind of theme, right? Secret Stream has this kind of wistful, almost romantic mood to it. A lot of people, when they read it, they think that Nathan is going to find love in the story, and it's kind of set up as a rom-com in some ways, right? Kind of lighter romantic story. That's the kind of mood. Obviously, it doesn't go that way, but that's the mood that's going on, right? So, mood is the emotion or feeling a story conveys, and tone is the attitude the author has towards the characters, the values, and the situations in the story, right? So, in Secret Stream, to return to that story, the author is sympathetic to Nathan, but in some ways is pointing at the limitations of Nathan's worldview. And in Lady with the Lamp, we get a much more hands-off kind of narrator, so the tone is much less overt. But obviously, the author is creating this voice that's revealing a lot about itself that we don't like as readers, right? This is not a likable voice as it goes on speaking. Let me just show you a video to show you an example of playing with mood, especially mood. If you're familiar with Frozen. This is a Disney movie. Here's a version of it that's taking it in a very different direction. Okay, so that's just a um, short video there. Let me get back to my slideshow. Maybe go down here, go up to here. Hmm. 1 second. There we go. Yeah, so just a short video playing with mood. If you've ever seen the movie Frozen, you know that it's not a very dark movie. It's a light movie filled with snow and um, uh, music. You know, do you want to build a snowman? It's a very jaunty tune. You know, it's about two sisters overcoming these problems in the world and coming together and forming that bond again. Whereas, you know, what the video I just showed you is obviously playing with that and turning what's a very light Disney movie for kids into something from a horror movie, playing with that mood. You know some of the things they did. I mean, it's all clips from the movie, but they've darkened the palette, right? They've made it dark. They've added this music, which is the music isn't exactly like creepy on its own, but it's kind of wistful music, and you add it to some of these scenes and the way it's cut together, and suddenly it creates this like juxtaposition of different moods, right, or different tones. And then you know the jump cuts, the sound effects, right, creates a very different kind of artifact, right? Very different mood, very different emotional effect, right? What I just showed you was kind of scary, I guess. Hope you weren't too scared. But you know, very much playing with that the horror music or the horror movie conventions to create that mood, and you know the tone as well. The attitude the author has towards those characters is, is Anna a serial killer or something? She has some really weird scenes in that they've cut together there, right? It looks like she's like strangling Anna at one point. Anyway, so just a fun way to think about how you can use different elements to create different moods, right? Using setting and for a movie you can use music and cuts and sound effects. For us writers, we use setting and character and plot development, things like that. Another big thing we use is something called empathy. And empathy, coming from a dictionary, the action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experience the feelings, thoughts, and experience of another of either the past or present without having the feelings, thoughts, and experience fully communicated in an objectively explicit manner. So it's a big mouthful. It just means like putting yourself in another person's shoes and having sympathy for another person. So one of the big things in fiction is this sense of empathy, right? Stories are inherently character-based, even if they're about animals or inanimate objects. Those are the characters for that movie, right? Think like Toy Story or something, right? It's about toys, but you feel empathy for Woody and Buzz, right? And that's important, the empathy you feel. If you don't feel empathy for the main characters, you're not going to value their struggle and see and side with them in the story. Now, you might there are times when you're not supposed to side with the protagonist or the main character of a story, right? If you're writing about a villain, but that's a different way of using empathy, right? Regardless of how you're using empathy, this is an important factor to think about, right? One of the questions you should be asking yourself is, how does the author want us to feel about the characters in the story? And for your own writing as well, how do I want my readers to feel about the characters in the story? And this is getting to tone. Your attitude or the author's attitude towards those characters is vital for steering the reader's reactions to the character's growth in the throughout the story, right? So let me talk about a couple points of view. We've read about these before, but I just want to cover them right now because it's important to think about these choices as you're setting up stories and as you're analyzing short stories, right? So basically, we get more complicated, but there are first, second, and third person point of view. Third person we can split into three big categories: unlimited omniscient, and omniscient just means all-knowing, right? Limited omniscient and objective. So unlimited omniscient, this is the third person, using third person pronouns, he, she, they, nouns, the woman, the tree, etc. And it has unlimited access to the thoughts of every character in the story. So this is that kind of like godlike perspective where you're looking in and and the author is telling you the story from everybody's point of view and goes in and out of everybody's thoughts and feelings, right? So that unlimited omniscient. Then we have limited omniscience. So it's using those third person pronouns, right? He, she, they, Mrs. Mallard, but only giving the reader limited access into the thoughts of the characters in the story. So maybe just one person's, right? And this is often used to withhold information from the reader for dramatic effect, right? So in the story of an hour, right, we're given we're taken into Mrs. Mallard's head, even though it's told from the third person perspective. We don't get everybody else's reactions. We get a little bit, but we're not taken in the same way we are with Mrs. Mallard. And this gets us to empathize with her to a greater extent, right? She feels kind of alone in the world because we're with her, and we get, we're privy to these beautiful sensory details that only she experiences, right? So it kind of takes us in a very limited way into her consciousness to give us her worldview without giving everybody else's, right? And that way it's much more focused on her reaction experience. Then there's the objective. This is using third person pronouns again, but no access to thoughts from characters in the story. So Lady with a Lamp, that story I was talking about earlier, and then Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants are both examples of using objective third person point of view, right? And this creates a much more like clinical kind of tone for the story, like it's harder to decipher the author's attitude towards a character sometimes, usually, if he or she is just describing the actions and speech without any of that narrative influence, right? So if you want that more that more objective clinical kind of tone, this is what you might think about using. Some authors use the second person pronouns, so that's using you, your, right? This is rarely used in fiction. There's some good examples. Margaret Atwood's story Happy Endings is a fun one, where she's it's kind of like a choose your own adventure of romantic stories, and she's using you to emphasize that you have the choice to decide how stories go and your own expectations as a reader. She's using second person to foreground that idea of our own complicity in romantic stories and how that's tied to gender roles and such. But it's not used very often because it can be kind of gimmicky in a way, right? Because you're commanding your reader to do certain things. So you should be very careful about using this and think about why you would want to use second person. First person is using the I and the we pronouns, right? It's a good way to take your reader into the mind of the character. Again, this is great for creating dramatic irony because you're writing from the first person perspective, but you might be revealing more about this character than the character him or herself understands about themselves, right? So the story Araby, right? Gazing up in the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity. My eyes burned with anguish and anger, right? So first person. Okay. Sometimes in the first person, these stories have an auditor, and that's a listener within the fiction whose reaction is part of the story, right? So an actual embodied persona within the story to whom the first person speaker is talking to. Oftentimes, like in Araby, they don't have that. It's just a first person speaking to who knows who, right? There's no identified person. But then sometimes, like in Lady with a Lamp, we have, the speaker who's speaking specifically to this character, Mona, right? Mona, stop it, please, Mona, right? And this speaker throughout the story reacts to Mona, right? So this auditor is this Mona, and the speaker is this unnamed woman who's visiting her. Also in the first person perspective specifically, or not specifically, but mostly, I guess you could do this in third person as well, but it wouldn't work the same, right? In the first person perspective, we sometimes have unreliable narrators. So stories narrated by insane, foolish, or deceptive narrators. And, there's a distance between what they're telling us and what the author or what the audience, the reader, understands is actually happening, right? So you might think about, in Araby, why do you trust that narrator? Because I think you do, right? You trust the narrator in Araby that he's telling us the truth about his childhood, about his experiences. He doesn't have to, but for some reason we trust that narrator. Whereas, the Mona's friend and Lady with the Lamp, we understand is deceptive and manipulative, right? And passive aggressive, right? And this all comes through in her speech, right? And this is deliberate. This is, the author playing with this for humor, right? Kind of a mean-spirited humor, perhaps, but humor nonetheless. So in conclusion, you should be asking yourself, how do I feel about the characters and situations in this text? What in the text leads me to think that, right? So it's a two-part thing. Your reaction is important, and then thinking about what leads you to think that, what specific literary elements.